What do we get when we combine water, lots and lots of flowing water, plus a city street, a couple of trees on either side of the street, and then leaves, more leaves than the waste management company can remove or haul away? What do you get? It sounds like the mess of autumn, right? It sounds like October. But there's another way you can look at that combination of elements, and it is healing. I want to speak with you this morning about the hope we have in the healing of the nations. And if you noticed in Revelation 22, verse 2, amid this apocalyptic symbolism of water, a city street, fruit-bearing trees, 12 kinds of fruit that bear their fruit each month, there are also leaves, right? And quite incidentally, it's mentioned the leaves are for the healing of the nations. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Scott, it's Halloween. I want a Halloween message. Why do we have to talk about the nations? The nations don't have anything to do with me. Well, quite the contrary. In fact, even though our eyes glaze over, right, when we hear about the nations often on the news in the 24-hour news cycle, you and I ostensibly are the nations, right? The ethnos, right? The ethnic groups to which God has reached out in the person of Jesus Christ, right? Originally, God's chosen people, the Jews, Jesus then among the Jews, and then through the person of Jesus, all the nations, all the ethnic groups, and that includes you. Now, years ago, there was a great book, this is back in the 80s, a guy named Neil Postman wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, and the point of it was that with every news story we see, with all the bombardment of information that we have, and we've now seen it exponentially rise over the years, we suffer from a low information to action ratio. In other words, when we hear about stuff happening in Syria or Afghanistan or South America or Japan, we hear about these things on the news and then we immediately want to respond. What can we do about it, right? But our actions are limited, right? Low information to action ratio, the acronym being LIAR, right? And the question is, right, to what extent is our exposure to the nations making us false to ourselves, right? Creating emotional cripples, right, on the world scene because we feel so inadequate to respond and then we shrink back even more. Now, the good news today is the book of Revelation is written by someone who is far more removed than you are from the scenes of the nations, right? Far more removed. Tickle, 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 right? He, John, was on the island of Patmos, right? Banished there, and he receives, amazingly, a vision of not only retreat from the world, right, and isolation from the world, but he receives a vision of the world being healed, right? These leaves that he speaks of are utterly, profoundly symbolic, right? The leaves that we see falling outside and returning to decay and dust. What if the leaves were for the healing of the nations, right? What if the leaves, what if something that we take for granted, right? Ordinary experience is meant to be healed. This is a scary hope. Why is it scary? Well, because we've seen again and again how We want reconciliation. We want peace. We want, right, all these great things that will resolve the world's troubles. And even in our own lives, the conflicts, we so want it. And yet, year after year, we seem to be repeating the same patterns, right? It's a scary hope. And sometimes we learn, perhaps, not to hope for it. You're full of feces. This is what someone said to me. This is what somebody said to me at a nursing home. I kid you not, right? I was there to visit, this will make sense in a minute. I was there to visit Lee and Ida Bell Stollard. And I was having a difficult time following them. They were an elderly couple, part of this church I was serving. And the reason I had trouble finding them is Ida Bell, someone pointed out Ida Bell, she's sitting at the table with this other gentleman. So I assumed this other gentleman was Lee, but it wasn't, right? Lee was coming down the corridor in a wheelchair wearing his World War II veteran's cap. And finally, when I got that sorted out, right, I realized that they were both suffering from terrible states of dementia, right? They often just didn't even recognize one another, right? Just think about the pain and the awkwardness of that. But I sat down with them and with this other nameless gentleman also at the table, and we had soup and crackers. And then Lee spoke up and he said, 3,500 men. I said, what? We lost 3,500 men, right? And he went on to describe in vivid detail, right, a memory that he had of serving on horseback. I didn't know they did this in World War II, serving on horseback in northern India, and a day in which 3,500 men were killed. And he said, why did I survive? And I tried to kind of make light of, the comment, why did I survive, And he looked up, and I said to him, to come back to Ida Bell. And she just stared at me like, huh? Right? Well, at that point, I just said, well, let's just pray. And we started to pray and prepare for a communion. And we ate the bread and we drank the wine. And we're going through the Lord's Prayer. They both remembered it, right? And they kind of looked at each other, right? And they had this moment, maybe I was just imagining it, of recognition. And we finished praying, and this strange man sitting there said, you're full of feces, right? And at that point, you have two choices, right? You can just ignore it or you can engage. And I chose to engage. And I looked at him and I said, we'll see. We'll see, right? And Ida Bell and Lee looked at him and they said, we'll see. Hope. We'll see, right? We will see, right? Our faith is a contentious affair, right? We're proclaiming the gospel message in the face of darkness, right? And it is an audacious thing to say there will be healing of the nations, right? And people say, you're full of it. We'll see. We'll see. What's the alternative, right? What is the alternative? To just retreat in despair and just kind of cocoon in our lives and pretend that the world doesn't exist, that people don't cry out in fear and pain and longing? We'll see. Will there be restoration? We've seen it before, right? I don't need to remind you, maybe I do. Nelson Mandela was a prisoner in South Africa for years and years, became the president of that resurrected country. What about more of that, right? It can happen. God can move. Back in sixth grade, I hope I didn't tell you this story before, but I'm going to tell you again. Sixth grade, we were studying a unit on the pyramids of Egypt. And, sixth grade, you don't try to get into graphic detail about all the drudgery through which people must have lived back then. We studied mainly dates of the pharaohs, and we studied the geometry of the pyramids. It was really nice. And the project that I did was I made a pyramid. And I had glued little parts of cardboard, right? And I received an A on this. I was walking home with my pyramid, and it was a windy day, and I was kind of balancing it on my right hand, and there were two people with me. One was a guy named Kenny. He was the only person of color in our elementary school, right? And the other guy was this kid named Bruce Ward. And we're walking along, and Kenny said something, right, that Bruce took offense to, and he called him spook, right? And it was kind of in that weird moment, where I'm trying to figure out who I am and who I should identify with. And so I sided with Bruce over Kenny, the person of color. And I had this pyramid in my hand, and I threw it at him. And the pinnacle of the pyramid hit him right below the eye, right? And I remember walking home that day just feeling horrible and weird. And the next day, sure enough, Mrs. Robinson had Scott Pyle, Bruce Ward, please come forward. And we had the chance to kind of talk about what went on, right? What went on. And we'll see, won't we? We'll see how those relationships will work out. We'll see, right? I never had the chance to go back to Kenny, right? Because he transferred to another school and say, man, I'm so sorry. I didn't have the maturity, right, to go back and say, I'm so sorry, because I was so insecure. I wanted to fit in. I'm sixth grade, right? Just think about all the things, right? You shared stuff already today. Just think about all the things about our growing up years that have hurt us, that have harmed us, right? And people do them intentionally and unintentionally. We'll see if there's healing. What's the alternative, my friends? To just wallow in our hurts and say, oh, right? We'll see. Well, I don't have much more to say than that, but I do have this encouragement. World Vision is a Christian organization that I mentioned to Dan a few weeks ago, and I've had time to work with them. World Vision they take in, believe this or not, it's amazing, 65 immigrant refugees per month come to Spokane, right? And they come perhaps not knowing the language. They come from places like Afghanistan, Bolivia, Chad, Guatemala, Mozambique, Russia, Syria, Thailand, Vietnam, Zimbabwe. They were once faceless people on the news, and now they're here in our streets. I'm wondering, as a possibility, whether or not Origin would like to, at some point, adopt a family, right? So they wouldn't just be on the news, they'd be here, sitting in places like you're sitting, and worshiping with us and singing with us. And maybe you've done this already. But I think every little bit, right, helps. It expresses our sense of hope and wonder moving forward. Finally, one of the things that I will say, it's been my pleasure to work with you so far, and I know that you're in a state of woundedness, in a sense of the church losing its beloved pastor of so many years. But out of great wounds, right, and the sharing of great wounds comes the hope of healing. My son, Philip, worked as a lifeguard a few summers ago, and he woke up one morning and he had scheduled to be a lifeguard that day at the Spokane Aquatic Center, and he was listening to his music with his earphones, right? And he pulled his earphones out, and there was like a little rubber part of the ear thing that got stuck, embedded in his eardrum. So he's like, Dad, I can't get this out, right? And I said, well, you can't go to work like that. So we go to the urgent care center, and eventually, right, somebody yanks it out. And then, I went to the pool that day, and I observed what Philip did, right? Do you realize that at a pool like the Spokane Aquatic Center, most of what lifeguards do is tell people to walk? Do you know? Right? Because the kids are so excited to get in the water, and they're just running around, and most of the accidents happen when they slip, right, on the slick concrete. And he's always saying, Philip is, walk, 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 right? And I remember watching him tell these little kids to walk, and I remember thinking, thank God for that technician, that physician, that doctor who removed that little thing from his ear. Because if something had happened, right, he couldn't do this, right? And thank God that maybe one day that child who doesn't slip and fall and hit her head on the pavement, that child grows up and becomes a lawyer, right, who helps resolve issues, between nations. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. We'll see. We'll see. Christ says, we'll see, right? Let's pray.